Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Think about the last time you were at a crowded metro station. Did you stop to think about what to do, or did you just look around and follow what everyone else was doing? Public policy at its core is an attempt to change behavior, but behavior is rarely driven by just one thing. It's shaped by a mix of habits, which is what we automatically do, norms, what we see others doing and what we think they expect from us, and incentives, which are the costs and rewards built into the system. I'm Shreya, and in this episode, we're going to unpack how these three forces work together. And joining me in this conversation is my colleague Arindam. Hi, Arindam. Thank you for joining, and it's great to have you here.
Hey, hi Shreya. Thank you for having me here. Looking forward to this discussion.
So, Arindam, I thought we'll first start with norms because they're often the invisible layer shaping behavior, what we believe others are doing and what we think they expect from us. Social norms are basically shared rules of behavior within a group or a society. They can be very local, like how people behave in a metro, or much broader. But at their core, they're really bundles of expectations that exist in our collective minds. And this is where Christina Bikiri's work is very helpful. She breaks norms down into two parts. One is what she calls empirical expectations, what we think other people are actually doing. And the second is normative expectations, what we think other people believe is the right thing to do. So, in her framework, a social norm really exists when both of these come together. So, it's not just that I see others doing something, it's also that I feel like they expect me to do it too. And it's this conditionality that makes my behavior possible. And I follow the norm because I believe others are following it and expect me to follow it as well. And there are so many examples of how this plays out through individual behaviors, right? Like, for example, metro queuing. If you're standing on a platform and you see everyone around you standing in a line, that's your empirical expectation. And if you also feel like other commuters expect you to stand in line, that's your normative expectation. When both of these are present, you join the queue almost automatically. But even if one of these is missing, that behavior starts to break down. Same with littering, right? If there is trash everywhere, you assume that everyone's littering and they're messing up the place. And if there's no visual enforcement, or there's no disapproval, or social disapproval, really, it starts to feel acceptable. But in a clean space where there are expectations set, there is enforcement also clearly visible, and people are not littering, then you're also likely to hold on to your waste. And this is true for traffic also. Jumping signals. If you see other people jumping signals and no one else seems to care, you are at some point likely to do it as well. So this is the main tenet that her theory of social norms offers. You see it in transit, you see it in public spaces. And what's interesting about this is that when norms become strong enough, they stop feeling like rules. They start to feel like identity, right? That's when behavior becomes widespread, because you're not just following a norm, you're expressing who you are. Like, for example, in Japan, queuing, maintaining silence in public transport and not littering are deeply embedded social norms. Similarly, in Singapore, strict enforcement has over time created strong norms around cleanliness and compliance. And in Germany, following rules no one is watching is seen as a basic part of civic behavior and being a good citizen, really. So what starts out as individual behavior over time has become social norms, because it's so closely tied to what you think is expected of you as well, and what you see other people doing or you think others are doing as well. And this really translates into bigger social groups, into even national identities. And this is great when it's a force for good, when it's used to change behavior positively. I want to talk some more about this and how it plays out in the Indian context, Arindam. But I'd love to hear if you have any immediate thoughts on this. But more importantly, I'd love to hear also about the second part of our conversation, right, which is on habits.
Right, right. Yeah, so before I go to that, I had one interesting thing that I was wondering about when I read about your the theory that you were talking about, right? So I wonder, when do we build that concept of what other people might think about us, right? So how do we build those norms? Is it through education right from childhood, or is it something that we can develop by enforcing rules, or is it through penalties that you enforce the behavior and then that becomes the norm? So I'm just wondering, because while we see all of these rules being followed, say in foreign countries, and we have Indians who probably do that when we go abroad, why don't we see the same behavior in India itself, right? I mean, you might have observed people breaking traffic rules, littering around, even when others are probably standing at the signal waiting for the light to turn green, etc. Right? So I was just wondering, what is the best time, or what's the best way to inculcate these norms in the psyche of people?
Wow, fascinating question, right? This is something we're all wondering about. Well, I am not an expert on this topic, but from what I've read and what Beckery's social norm theory suggests is that social norms are, by definition, they are socially administered. So social approval, social disapproval is what makes these norms stick and what makes them more powerful over time. Sure, rules exist, enforcement is in place, but you will see that a lot of common social norms are they endure because after a point they are completely, powered by social approval and social disapproval. Like, for example, right, even if you look at transit systems like metro systems, you will see that in a lot of countries there is very clear escalator etiquette, for example, right? In some countries you stand to the right, in some countries you stand to the left, but there is an etiquette to it. It's quite possible that some of this started out with basic enforcement, with visual cues, some amount of changing cues, but over time that's been socially accepted as a norm, and then many years later it's commuters who enforce it themselves. So you follow because everyone else is doing it, and you perceive that expectation of you need to follow suit as well. So when you bring India as an example, right, the thought that comes to me is, while most of us follow traffic, somehow the second part of the social norm theory, which is the idea that you are expected to do the same and this is the right thing to do, that probably hasn't kicked in strong enough for the defaulters.
Right.
So that is where I'm at with this. Also, our history of weak enforcement is also there, right? It's not like we have also somewhere set this as a precedent which is then taken up by commuters on the road as something to follow, right? We
Right.
haven't received much help on that
Yeah.
front. But also, just a little bit more on that, we're also a very low trust society. I wonder if that also plays a part in us not really looking to each other for cues, not trusting what we think we expect from each other, right? There is this thing of, can we expect certain, civilities from each other, right, in public spaces? I'm not sure that idea is very mature in India, at least in
Right.
our collective mindsets.
Yeah, I had a theory about this, at least on the traffic part that I'd written about, I think in a LinkedIn post. But it's not a well-formed theory, but something that I've been just wondering about, with respect to traffic signals, right? And why we have that penchant of, breaking rules, not waiting for the signal to turn green, or honking as soon as the signal turns green, right? I think our perception of the benefit of following rules is overwhelmed more by the fact that we believe even if we follow the rule at every signal, there's no guarantee that our ride ahead would be so smooth that we reach, say, our destination on time. And that would be because our roads are not designed that well. We'll have some choke points up ahead. We'll probably have roads, bad roads that will slow us down. So the ultimate destination of a travel is to reach somewhere, right? And if we are guaranteed that by following rules everybody benefits, then only we will follow the rules, right? But in India, even if you follow the rules, you will get stuck up in some bottleneck up ahead. And therefore, we have the urge to cut corners wherever possible to save time on the obstacle that's at hand right now, so as to save time for some obstacle that might be up ahead. But anyway, that's a not a very well formed theory that I have. But this is a good time to maybe segue into the other theory that we wanted to discuss today, and that's about the power of habits. It's actually from a book by the same name by Charles Duhigg, and maybe I'll talk about what's that idea. So the main gist of that theory is that most of what people do every day is not actually a conscious choice. It is a habit, and that's driven by a simple three-step neurological loop of cue, routine, and reward that our brain actually executes almost automatically. The brain actually doesn't really need to think about anything when it's actually executing that particular habit. And the key insight is that habits cannot simply be eliminated. They must be replaced. Even if you keep the same cue and reward, the routine or the habit needs to be changed. You need to insert a new routine in between. And in the book, he's applied it far beyond just individuals. He's applied it to organizations, social movements, and entire societies too. And the key learning from that is that the most powerful lever for change is often not just persuasion or enforcement or penalties, right? Which we think as the best way to generally enforce any change or any behavior. He says that the redesign of environments, the defaults, and social norms that helps shape the daily behavior. So, what he says is that good governance and public policy design or civic design should actually work with human neurology rather than against it. We should try to make good behavior the path of least resistance, that people will opt for with the least resistance, and then our brain takes over, or rather the brain lets go and it lets the habit take over, right? So that's the main concept. Most of what we do in a day is not a conscious choice, and there's the habit loop of cue, routine, and reward. The cue is a trigger that tells the brain to go into an automatic mode, and he had actually tested this by plugging in things to the brains of mice and etc. Not he, as in people have tested this
Right.
out, and there's this core of the brain called the basal ganglia. It's the part which controls this habit behavior, and what happens is it's the deeper, more primitive structure of our brain, maybe indicating that it's in the evolutionary chain. It's the one that developed as early as earlier than the outer structures of the brain. And what that does is it frees up the conscious mind for other things. So you must have seen this, right? So when you're driving, probably you can also maybe check things on your phone. You can compose an email in your head. You can maybe sing, etc. Right? So driving, for example, becomes the habit. So the routine part that he talks about, that's the behavior itself, which can be physical, it can be mental, it can be emotional, and the reward is what tells the brain that this loop is worth remembering. It stores it somehow in the basal ganglia, and that's what tells the brain that if there's this cue, go for this routine, right? And then it becomes, from there onwards, it becomes pretty much automatic. So and he had an example in his book. There was this man called Eugene Pauly. He had no memory, but he still had habits. He had contracted, I think, viral encephalitis, and that had destroyed his hippocampus. That's the region of the brain that's responsible for forming new memories. So while he couldn't remember what he had eaten for breakfast, or that he had family, or that he had grandchildren, yet every morning what he would do is he would get up, he would walk the same route around his neighborhood, and he would find his way home, right? And if you asked him to draw a map of his street or how he came back home, he wouldn't be able to tell, but his feet knew while he was walking, right? Or his brain knew what to do, where to go, which turns to take, right? So that's the habit storing part of the brain that kicked in whenever he went for a walk. So that's one example. Maybe before I go on to other aspects of this, are there any examples from the theory that you had that you would like to talk about?
I've read the first chapter of this book. Like all nonfiction, I've only read about the introduction and the first chapter of the book. But I remember this instance of this senior, right, who had lost his memory, and then he took a walk around his house. I clearly remember that. And so in that sense, it's quite clear, right, what to make of the habit loop. But I was recently reading about the theory behind the power of habits. And one example that really stood out for me in terms of just, I think, making it more tangible was, if you think of it like making a digital payment, then the QR code is the queue, the scanning is the routine, and the reward is basically the speed, ease of avoiding using physical cash. Would you think that as an accurate representation?
Yes, yes. I think, in fact, if you, so now since you're talking about it, we have replaced the habit of paying with cash with the habit of immediately reaching for our mobile phones and paying digitally, right? So
Yeah.
the queue remains the same that we have to pay. You eat something at a restaurant, or you eat something at, say, the Pani Puri Thela, and you want to pay the person. You don't immediately reach for your wallet. You now keep searching for a QR code stuck somewhere. That's the new habit that's formed. And if we look at it from the government's point of view, if it were to nudge us into digital payments, this was a wonderful way to do it, right? I mean, you make the habit so simple, you make it so rewarding that you make the payment, you don't have to carry around cash. So that's the reward that you get at the end, and the brain
Yeah.
tells you do it this way, right? So yeah.
Yeah, you're right. We've totally switched, right? In fact, now if by chance I decide to want to pay by cash, a lot of physical stores are not very clued into that process anymore, right? They either don't have change, or they're unwilling to offer change, or it's actually more work for them in that, at least the supermarkets I go to,
Mhm.
there are multiple UPI payments happening at the same time. All the cashier has to do is stamp the bill as soon as they hear that this UPI payment has been made. Whereas
Right.
now, if they're going to go back to the original earlier habit of doing cash payments, they would at least have to have two more cashiers there to tender change. So there have been, benefits in. So this habit has had ramifications, I think, for how things are done now, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I was also reading a little bit more about this, and it looks like there are also different ways how governments and local administrations have played with the idea of a queue, right? Like, for
Mhm.
example, now
Yep.
you see waste segregation has very clear color coded bins. You'll see it in all public places, right? Like they
Mhm.
have green, red, or sometimes they'll have clear instructions of paper, plastic. That is also a cue, right?
Right. Exactly, exactly. So, I mean, apart from the fact that it becomes easier for the waste handlers to, segregate things and stuff like that, having properly. So, I mean, the routine also has to be easy enough, not very complex, but it also has to have some rewards, right? So, at the end, there's also this concept of you belonging. To a group of people who are following the rules, right? So while I also see the habit routine change part in this particular waste bin example, there's another concept that's mentioned in the book, and that's about the concept of identity, right? The belief and the community part, right? So as per the theory, and he has given the example of Alcoholics Anonymous, but I'll come to that later. But just to talk about the theory, he says that habits change most durably when they occur within a group or within a community that shares that sense of belief, right? So if you look at the waste bin example of having it color coded, etc., at the end it also comes down to a sense of identity, a sense of feeling belonging to a group of people who are doing something which they think would be rewarding to society at large and to themselves as such also, right? So there's that feeling also that drives higher compliance, right? For example, there's also the tax filing example that people generally give, right? So way back, I think in the 2000s or something, the UK's behavioral insights team, that was the original nudge unit, right? That applied this logic to tax compliance. So what it did was it sent people letters saying that most people in your area have already paid. Such sort of. So if you see that now, even with our IT department, right, sending emails saying that some people have paid, or these many people generally pay, or the dates are coming for advanced tax payment, etc., etc., right? So that sort of acts as a social cue. It makes paying feel like a normal routine, and the reward is also a sort of relief from what you can call cognitive dissonance, right? Now that you're part of the majority, you're part of the majority, or part of the good group that's actually paying, right? So that example also helps. There's
You're absolutely right, Sorry to
Mhm.
butt in, but
Yeah.
when you first started talking, I thought of habits as a sort of a closed loop thing. Like if designed
Mhm.
really well, then I don't need to bring identity into this at all. Because if you look at the waste bin or even like the traffic signal, right,
Mhm.
it's quite objective.
Right.
There are separate bins for things, there are separate lights for traffic changes, and so there is no ambiguity there in a well-designed habit system, that is. But
Mhm.
then if I decide to throw trash on the road before I can cross to the sidewalk and actually access those three bins, then that habit's not going to work, right? All of that setup is not going to work. So somewhere I agree with you in that identity switch is also important for you to go that extra mile of holding on to your trash, I think, till you can reach this waste disposal
Right.
setup.
Right, right. So it also ties into your norm, the theory about around norms that you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
What people expect, you think other people expect you to do, right? So if we can make it a normal routine for people to go that extra mile to hold on to their trash so that they can throw it into a dustbin, then that sort of also ties into the fact that you feel you are expected to do that, right? You feel
Yeah.
people want you to do that.
I think
So.
that's how norm change happens on a smaller micro level, I'm assuming, by shifting immediate actions, the
Mhm.
cue, routine, and reward. You see
Mhm.
this in, I think, transit systems very acutely about how signages are added to make a shift,
Mhm.
or people are added on stations to make sure that, commuters allow others to deboard before they get on. There will be people inside a metro car, and sometimes to make sure people are not standing near the doors. So
Right.
this amount of enforcement, I think, will happen a few times or for
Right.
multiple years before that kicks in as a social norm, and then that's enforced by itself long term. But tell me this, are all habits at the same level, or are there some habits that can have cascading effects?
Yes, yes. So, great that you brought this in, because while you were talking about that waste bin example or the metro thing, right? What really struck me was that if you ask people to change a lot about the habits that they were following earlier, right? So, waste paper bin, for example, if you ask them to segregate it, if you ask them to also, but you don't tell them how to do it in a way that's easy enough for them, because I've seen this in my society, in my apartment also, right? We had rules earlier, but then the rules were not very clear. It was not really clearly mentioned whether you need to have those colored bins or should you have liners inside the dustbin,
Right.
etc. Right? So that was confusing. So that then that routine did not kick in. Then they had to clarify the rules. They had to make it small steps. Right? Similarly, if you want to bring in change, you can't bring it in abruptly or wholesale. Right? So that's where
Yeah.
these other two concepts that are mentioned in the book are, I think, pretty insightful. One is the example, the concept of keystone habits, where he says that not all habits are equal. Right? So he says there are some keystone habits which are habits that change everything else. They create a sort of ripple effect, and that transforms behaviors of other such behaviors. So there's a domino effect that happens, right? So he gives multiple examples. One of them is that of exercising, right? So research shows that when people begin exercising even once a week, right, they then
Hmm.
tend, without actually anybody telling them, they tend to start eating better, they tend to start sleeping more, spending less, etc., etc., right? They become more patient with their own families, with people at work. So that one habit reshapes the landscape around it. Now this is at the individual level. He also gives an example of something that he tracked at an organizational level. He gives an example of some company called Alcoa, which was a struggling aluminium giant at that point, and the new CEO who came in at that point, people expected him to talk about the usual things, right? Profits and margins. But instead, he spoke about something very different. He spoke about worker safety. And he announced that his single most important goal was zero injuries, right? I mean, this was baffling for everybody. But he realized that to achieve that zero injuries target, every unit president had to report accidents to him. They had to be in constant contact with floor managers. Workers also felt empowered because, this was something pretty much within their control. And that sort of had a cascading effect. That goal had a cascading effect on different habits that people had on the shop floor, right up to the executives, right? So that's an example. And the
So
other thing,
that's another. Sorry, please
yeah,
continue.
yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
No, so
Yeah.
That's another similarity I see with the social norms theory, in that if implemented at scale, it has benefits for the entire social group. Like in this case, it's an organization. I agree that it's something visioned by the founder, but it does alter behavior for everyone working in that organization.
Right. And I think this also ties into the other concept of the power of small wins, right? So you make small changes, these could be keystone habits, and that gives you small wins, and then that sets in motion other forces that then favor another small win. Then you get another small win, and then that cascades, right? So he gives the example of the gay rights movement in the 1970s, and he says that they didn't achieve an early breakthrough because of some Supreme Court judgment, etc. Right? They started small small in the sense that they started by convincing the Library of Congress to just reclassify books on homosexuality from their earlier category of abnormal sexual relations to a new category, and that new category was called Gay Liberation Movement. Now you see that negative tonality to a positive tonality change here, right?
Right.
This simple reclassification, what it did was it made things a little more positive. It helped people get out of the stigma to some extent, right? And then it triggered fundraising drives, and it also very interestingly, it emboldened openly gay politicians to run for office. So that was a small win that made everything else possible. The other
Yeah.
anecdote is that of the just a small anecdote that he gave of the Montgomery bus boycott, right? And we all know about that. But what he interestingly says is that Rosa
For
Parks.
listeners, if you could add a couple of lines, it'll be
Right.
useful.
So what happened was Rosa Parks was not the first black woman who was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, right? And this was in the US of those years when blacks were being mistreated. They are still, but I mean that was when it was very bad. And what so this lady who was arrested was not the first one to be arrested. Several women before her had been arrested, some in the same year also, right? But none of those arrests then led to a boycott of the scale that we saw after her arrest, right? And what was the reason behind this? It could be argued about, but he says that it was also her extraordinary social fabric. She was part of multiple communities, her church, botanical club, some I think knitting group,
Right.
etc. Right? So he what sociologists call strong ties with every stratum of the Montgomery society. So when she was arrested, the social habits of friendship took over, and her friends told her friends, etc., etc. So those were small wins, and those keystone habits or those social habits kicked in, and this entire civil rights movement was not therefore just built on ideology, right? It was built on social habits and networks. So keystone habits as well as the concept of small wins really helps us explain these that particular phenomena.
How interesting. The second part of your anecdote, which was the fact that the social group she was part of also came to her help. This was something that I wasn't aware of. This is, I think, lots of unifying threads from the time we've started speaking on how social groups help reinforce norms, and how habits themselves are formed and sustained, right? But a big part of how we think about habits is also that if you want to change a habit, you have to either instead of a reward, there has to be a high cost there, like a punishment. But your example of how the just shifting the vocabulary for the gay rights movement has itself changed that habit in a way, right? Changed the cue is also different. So it also, I think, bears mentioning that to change a habit, you can also just stop it, right? You don't have to have an alternate habit to offer in many cases.
Yeah, and to some extent it might be true. I mean, for some people it might be easy to just stop it. Just the concept of the reward at the end might be enough. But it's sometimes not always as easy to stop the old routine because your brain still craves for that reward, right? So there's the concept of craving for the reward, which actually makes us follow a routine, pick up a routine, right? The brain thinks there's a cue and there's a reward at the end. Now, how do I satisfy that craving? I need to pick up a routine, and that routine is what we need to change, right? So therefore, for example, that's the example. I mean, if you talk about smoking, right? I mean, my father, for example, gave up smoking one fine day, and just because of that, right? I mean, there was no other routine that we put in, but others are not able to do that. I mean, and there must be something to it, right? Now, to talk about smoking itself, let's look at the smoking in public places problem that we have, right? So, if we look at the UK's 2007 ban on smoking, right? So if you look at it, this ban actually restructured the habit loop by eliminating some social cues. So what used to happen earlier was smokers' routines were heavily cue driven, right? You go to a pub, you have after dinner drinks, you have time of
Right.
course, etc. And if you and all of this used to happen indoors. Say wherever you're working, you just go for that one smoke, etc. Right? But then if you remove that particular routine by in this case by banning it, you ban smoking indoors, the policy has removed the most powerful cue, and it has forced the routine to be rebuilt around less compelling ones, right? So you have to now go outside. If it's
Right.
raining, you can't go out, then you have to go separate from the people with whom you're partying, and one or two of you have to go outside, and then so that sort of social separation aspect also comes in. So this is what would
Right.
we call this? This would be something like a policy skewed disruption, right? Rather than a willpower based deterrence that has worked in this case.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's about redesigning cues and
Yeah.
then aligning incentives and making that behavior less socially acceptable. So that there is a new habit that gets a chance to
Yeah, you
be
make that
formed.
habit less socially acceptable, or you bring about a new habit that is more socially acceptable. So
More socially acceptable.
the one fascinating example is that of the school lunch redesign that happened in the US, right? So again, following the example of behavioral economists, what some school districts in the US did was that they redesigned the cafeteria lines so that the healthy foods were at the front and at the eye level, right? So the queue is hunger, plus you enter a cafeteria, right? So that's like the queue. The routine defaults to what you grab, what's most visible, what's most accessible, right?
Yeah, you fill your plate
Now,
first.
yeah. So what you do now is you change that routine by making healthy foods more accessible, more visible, or the most visible thing, right? So that sort of
Yeah. So by the
redesign is.
time you get to the junk food, you've already put some things on your plate, and so then you can take lesser of the, I think, unhealthy food that's
Right. And I
available.
think all of these examples from at the personal level that we are thinking of, we can take all of this to a public policy design aspect also.
Yeah.
So these are all public policy also in some sense, right? Redesigning healthy habits, right? Redesigning food or lunch policies so as to have healthy foods being eaten a lot. So that's also part of public policy, but you can use these examples even at a higher level, right? There's been some examples we can even talk about, but yeah, you were saying something.
Yeah, this just for me it just goes to show how that even when you're redesigning, a ban can never be an option. You have to offer a more socially acceptable option and a less socially acceptable option,
Mhm.
and then find a way to sort of maneuver that. But you were talking about how this can be applicable at much larger scales, right? You
Right.
did speak about organizations. Could we also look at this at like a national scale or maybe an international scale, perhaps?
Yeah. I mean, there are examples of public policy being designed at the national level. I mean, I don't know if they followed this particular framework, but you can find concepts from this being applied there, right? So the whole auto enrollment into pension schemes, for example, right? I mean, I guess the UK started it, etc. The US also did it. India also has that, right? So Q is what you start a new job. And the routine is that you're automatically enrolled into a workplace pension, or in our case, the PF scheme, right? And the reward is that the employer also matches those contributions, and you have the psychological comfort of you're sorted for your retirement thing, right? So
Right.
literally, enrollment rates in the UK jumped from I think around 50s or something to over 80s once the policy was launched, right? You have an example of this even in case of privacy laws, right? If you look at it, it's not yet there in India, but in under GDPR and in the EU, for example, you have the opt out as the default behavior when you for example sign up for any service, right? If say for example if you sign up for say a social or an e-commerce app, for example, the default check out there has to be that you don't opt in to share your data for marketing purposes, etc. In India, if you see, it's always checked in. The checkbox is always checked. You have to literally uncheck it to make sure that you don't allow cookies, you don't allow your data to be used. In the
Sure.
EU and all, this has been changed to make sure that it's always opted out. So that enforces the behavior or the routine of people not wanting to share their data, and that becomes the default routine, that becomes the default behavior, that becomes the habit. And then you start asking for this sort of behavior in all sorts of interactions that you have with either the state or with other private entities. You don't want your data to be shared. So privacy also has this aspect applied to it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
You can find that in all these. For example, if you want to have a better health outcomes, right? So the Singapore government, for example, had this healthy 365 app or something. I don't remember exactly, but that rewarded citizens with vouchers for tracking steps and participating in health challenges. So the queue was what you had a daily phone notification, I think, and the routine was you just log your activity. And the reward was very tangible. You had vouchers for grocery or transport, something of that sort. So
Right.
this was a deliberate public sector habit loop, right? You had the public sector sort of trying to build a habit, and it's on the same architectures as you have in commercial fitness apps, but now you want to tie it to national health targets. Yeah.
Exactly.
But again, it bears in mind that sometimes this concept has failed not because the concept itself doesn't work, but because maybe it was not applied properly. So we can come to those examples also. But yeah, if you have any examples that you want to talk about.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the habit psychology and choice architecture principles are being used so well in like retail, e-commerce, online shopping, all of that, right? It's interesting to see them being applied in public policy contexts as well. And like you just mentioned, that sometimes in many cases, they don't work as well or they haven't had results. I wonder, in light of our conversation and what I've been reading, is also that it needs to work in collaboration with like norms and incentives. Habits alone are only as powerful as the context and the environment that they function in, right? Along with well structured incentives and social norms, it then I think becomes all the more powerful.
Right. And I think the context, a lot of things matter. I guess the context matters, how you enforce things matter, right? And how you're designing that loop, that matters. So, for example, if you had something like the sugar tax in the UK, Mexico, and all of some other countries, right? So it was, and even if you think of it right now, say if you want to disincentivize sugar consumption and you say, okay, let's come up with a sugar tax. I mean, apart from the economic aspects of it, now, does it really work? Because this is essentially a punishment intervention, right? You
Right.
think of it as a habit intervention that you're trying to change habits, but it's actually a punishment intervention. Now, it's supposed to work. It's supposed to disrupt the routine by making the reward less rewarding, right? So it costs more now to do the same routine, but
Hmm.
it might fail, or it has actually failed because it doesn't provide an alternative loop. So what happens is some manufacturers reformulated some products, but people who are like heavy consumers, especially in lower income groups, they often this still kept buying. The elasticity was not something that really changed, right? So the cue is what thirst, habit, or your taste preference, and the reward, right? Reward was like sweetness, familiarity, the sugar jump, etc. Right? That remained powerful, but you didn't have a proper substitute routine.
Right.
Similarly, the anti-drug campaigns also, right? Campaigns like "Just Say No," etc., right? Those work with people. Some people, maybe. I mean, just saying no. I don't know. I'm not an expert in drug enforcement or drug routines, etc. But apparently, that also failed because it didn't offer any viable alternative. So it's just saying no is an absence of behavior, right? It's not really replacing anything.
Right.
So if you leave adolescents with the same cues, with the same underlying reward that they crave for, but you don't give them a substitute routine, then it's not going to work. So
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. From like a first principles point of view, it's only when you offer a replacement or an alternative does the social acceptability aspect of it come, right? When you can measure which A or B, which option is better or more socially acceptable. If you have only
Mhm.
one option and you disincentivize that without giving an alternative or making the alternative more viable or approachable, then it is falling short in many ways, right?
There's also the concept that the queue also matters, right? During COVID-19, we had massive hand hygiene campaigns, right? We had massive public campaigns urging regular hand washing. Now, compliance obviously initially it sparked because it was something new, but then obviously it dropped off, right? The problem was that hand washing is like only a powerful habit when it is queue anchored, right? When you think you have a proper queue for triggering that habit,
Right.
like before meals or after the toilet, or if you ask people to randomly wash hands throughout the day, there's even if it's an invisible thread that they have, you don't really provide a cue to them. But if you tie those interventions, like if you tie hand washing to existing cues, like for example entering a building or touching a lift button or sitting down at a desk, that worked. And so campaigns that didn't do that didn't really work. Yeah.
Right. Quite a lot of takeaways from what we've discussed, right? Just in terms of requirements for successful habits to take shape. And one example that I was reading about that I found useful in tying all of these together was the example of seatbelt use. You'll see that there are incentives, like fines exist for drivers who are not, and even accompanying passengers for not wearing seatbelts. And it's also now widespread as a norm. And it's also a habit, right? You do it without thinking about it. It's the first thing you do as soon as you sit inside your vehicle. And there is a lot of social disapproval against people who don't wear a seatbelt, right? You could endanger yourself, you could endanger other people in your vicinity as well. So I think that's an example of how norms, habits, and I think incentives have also come together. To now, it's an unremarkable intervention. Now it's just, yes, wear seatbelts. Why wouldn't you wear a seatbelt? But I guess if you go back in time and this was a novel idea, I'm pretty sure there would have been a slow process of making this acceptable.
Right, I'm sure. I'm sure there must be so many of our current habits that when that might have seemed so revolutionary at the time when we actually started with those
Yeah,
habits.
yeah, and it's now a common norm, right? Like now, almost every workplace around the world, it's known that if you are ill, please wear a mask when you come into work. And I'm sure this wasn't as widespread some years back, pre-COVID. I mean, it is a common courtesy, but I don't think it was implemented or adopted in the way it is right now. So it's something that has gone from a common courtesy to becoming a habit, and now it's a norm. If you are even slightly unwell, you are expected to wear a mask.
Right, right. I think COVID did had a lot to contribute to that, because even before that there were illnesses, but then along came COVID, which was fatal to some extent, to some degree, and it was scary, right? And so therefore that fear of the unknown, right, that kicks in. So now if you see somebody coughing, even if it might be due to a common cold, you don't want to take that risk of finding out later that no, it was something fatal or it was something scary. So you want to mask up
Yeah.
as soon as possible. Yeah.
And I probably don't know too much about this, but I think post COVID, it's also changed the way flus happen to us, in that they are long drawn. They're somewhat different symptomatically. And, I think there's a lot more dread to falling ill, because you have symptoms for a longer period of time. And they can also be somewhat confusing in that they can be fatigue, they can be, brain fog. All those kinds of lesser known symptoms are also part of the mix. And so I think that's also added to that amount of social disapproval. But there is a sizable amount of social disapproval to something like this, which I think makes me feel very optimistic about the idea of behavior change, right? I mean, some of these have started out from nowhere, and now they're completely acceptable and absolutely required in our collective minds, right? As
Yeah.
thoughts. So I think that would be a good place to stop, Arindam. I'll take your final
Yeah.
thoughts before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think this entire these two theories that we talked about, and I'm sure there must be other theories, are very important for public policy practitioners or public policy analysts to think about, right? I mean, how do we change society's default behavior? Penalties, etc., don't seem to be working as properly as we want them to be. So, what can we learn from these concepts of norm setting, of habits? How can we apply these behavioral science concepts to to design better public policy. I think that's something we need to really consider. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have said it better. I'm going to be looking at the intersection of norms, habits, and incentives a little bit more to see how I can understand all of this better. I think you'll have to go a little deeper to understand, because from the top, it's all very abstract. But thank you so much, Arindam, for this conversation. I feel like I have a lot of takeaways from this, and I hope our listeners have takeaways too and plan on reading more about this very fascinating topic.
Yeah, I
Thanks
would
again.
really recommend them to read the book Power of Habits. That's a wonderful read. Apart from the fact that it has a lot of these interesting concepts, it's a wonderful read also. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Arindam. Thanks again. Very
Thank you.
insightful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.